Okay, good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for our discussion of post-Sandy planning and design and recovery in New York City and the metropolitan region. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Joyce Rosenthal, and I'm Assistant Professor of Urban Planning and also the co-coordinator of our program in Risk and Resilience in our Advanced Studies program at the GSD. So I'd like to start out introducing just a couple of the concepts, trying to frame the discussion tonight, and then introduce our panelists. So here at the GSD, our research and program in risk and resilience has sought to examine and understand the conditions under which urban communities can be resilient to rapid change, whether from a changing atmosphere and coast or for conflicts and migration, and how in planning and design can lead in fostering healthy communities under these uncertain conditions that we're facing very certainly. Resilience, of course, is a very contested concept. Like sustainable development, it has many layers of meaning. Originally derived from the field of ecology, it's become a core concept for post-disaster recovery, and it's come to mean the ability of communities and urban residents to regain their social, cultural, economic, and physical functioning after a very extreme disruption. It's the creation of a new equilibrium under changing conditions. So we've had an extreme event in New York. Superstorm Sandy came barreling into the New Jersey and New York coast almost 4 months ago with hurricane force winds. It was a Category 1 in terms of winds, but a devastating Category 5 storm surge that flooded neighborhoods, destroyed thousands of homes, and left millions without power, notably tens of thousands in public housing projects in New York City who also didn't have, in addition to electricity, water or heat for an extended period of time. So the superstorm really shook up our sense of vulnerability to increasing risks on the East Coast, certainly, and galvanized a very clear response in the planning and design community to addressing increasing climate risks, and that's what we'll discuss tonight. Sandy was a large hurricane even before it hit the East Coast near New Jersey, and impacts started in Jamaica and Haiti, where there was a significant loss of life, and stretched from Florida out to Wisconsin and all the way up to Maine. Perhaps the greatest impacts were in New York and New Jersey, where we're going to focus our discussion of these issues tonight. Despite years of warning from climate scientists and hazard scientists and some environmental activists who we're fortunate to have here tonight of the potential threats of storm surge to urban communities and neighborhoods, somehow it all came as a great shock to everybody. And perhaps it is still a great shock. As with Katrina, the storm exposed the social fault lines of our society as the impacts of disasters are never evenly distributed, as Mike Davis and others remind us. Sandy collided not only with existing social spatial inequities and disproportionate burdens for some areas, but also with the long-term cumulative effects of neoliberal policies that shrank local government to the point perhaps of an endgame of urban restructuring. So into this gap stepped New Yorkers and community organizations, neighbors helping neighbors, small nonprofits and residents as first responders immediately after Sandy. Local organizers with groups such as the Red Hook Initiative found themselves feeding thousands of people a day, relying on donations and just hard labor. Under very extreme conditions, the community did the work that was critical to survival for many people, and the government was not doing. So how do community priorities get expressed in these recovery efforts? In a recent meeting of environmental justice organizations organized by Eddie Bautista, the federal government's representative to the Sandy Recovery Task Force said, federal disaster funding is only for fixing what was broken recently. But if disaster recovery funds do not begin to address pre-existing hazards and inequities, is that acceptable to us as the planning and design community? New York City has often led in the future of creative design and planning innovations, and will the shock of Sandy prompt the creation of an adaptive and transformational urbanism and governance, or will the physical transformations of Sandy, of the superstorm, leave only incremental change in process and code? At what scale shall we address our efforts in the region? So these are some of the questions we'll begin to touch on. There's so many, we can't discuss everything tonight, but we expect to leave time for a discussion with you. So for tonight's events, first I want to thank the really energetic and creative support of the sponsors, the GSD Alumni Office, the Urban Planning and Design Department, the GSD Events Office, the Advanced Studies Program in Risk and Resilience, and the Harvard Club of New York. It's been amazing and terrific to work with Jen Halloran, Chantel Blakely, Ben Prosky, and their colleagues, and we really greatly appreciate your inspiration and collaboration. I've asked our speakers to address the impacts of the superstorm, planning and design for urban resilience, and Sandy recovery, all in a really short span of time, but they're really amazing speakers, so I know they can do that. And with the remaining time, we will sit together as a panel and answer questions and discuss these issues. Each of our speakers is a leader in their field and very deeply immersed in post-Sandy recovery, and I'm really grateful that they've been able to take time out from very busy schedules to share their work and ideas with our community. So to save time, I will introduce our speakers first in their order of presenting, and then let their presentations begin and let them pass off to each other after their presentation ends. So our first speaker is Walter Meyer, who graduated with a master's in landscape architecture and urban design in 2003. And he's a founding principal of Local Office Landscape Architecture in Brooklyn, New York. He founded the firm in 2006 with GSD classmate Jennifer Bolstad, who's MLA 2002. Operating between infrastructure, urbanism, and territory, the firm has garnered accolades from across the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, public policy, science, and art. The firm's recent built work includes the Parque del Litoral in Meyer, Puerto Rico. The 2-mile-long urban beach park is the largest in the country. This park restructured the post-industrial shores into a dune forest that protects the city from sea surges, while phytoremediation wetlands protect the sea from the city's pollution. After Hurricane Sandy, the firm's partners started Power Rockaways Resilience, a nonprofit dedicated to fundraising and delivery of solar generators to volunteer centers throughout the coastal Rockaway Peninsula in Queens, New York. Currently, Local Office is advising the National Parks Department, the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, the Army Corps of Engineers, and others on coastal resiliency in the New York Bight. Our next speaker is Abby Sucko, also an alumni at MARC from the GSD. So we have a strong alumni presence tonight. Abby is president of the nonprofit Culture Now, an organization that emerged from the mobilization of the New York City design community after the 9/11 disaster. She's practiced architecture with Pay Cobb Freed and Partners, Hardy Holtzman Pfeiffer, Sert Jackson Associates, and Site after graduating from the GSD. Abby continued that collaboration as a consultant on several buildings, including Harvard's next-door neighbor, CGIS. At Abby Sucko Architect, her work ranges from residential to institutional, including the Harvard Club of New York and the Boardman Residence, which has won multiple awards. As president of Culture Now, she designed and distributed over 500,000 cultural and historical maps of New York, and now leads the Museum Without Walls project to create an acoustic guide to the environment, which has developed prize-winning smartphone apps. She's also curated the exhibitions Mapping the Cityscape and From Maps to Apps at the BSA Space. Her book, By Their Own Design, published with the Whitney Library of Design, was based on a GSD student lecture series she coordinated. Ms. Sucko is the recipient of a 2012 AIA New York State President's Award. And our third speaker is Thad Pulaski, pardon me. He is Associate Urban Designer for the Office of the Chief Urban Designer of the City of New York, Department of City Planning. And Thad will share his experience working as an advisor on long-term planning to the Mayor's Office of Housing Recovery from Sandy. He's currently working on large-scale neighborhood and infrastructure projects, including the development of the Penn Station area and Hudson Yards, and has previously worked at the Office of Emergency Management, where he developed a design competition for post-disaster urban housing in New York, What If New York City? And I think he's going to discuss that a little bit tonight. He earned a Master in Architecture and Certificate in Urban Design from the University of Pennsylvania and a BA from the University of Pittsburgh. And our last speaker for the evening, Eddie Bautista, is Executive Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, which is a network of community-based organizations advocating for the empowerment and just treatment of environmentally overburdened neighborhoods. Previously, Eddie served as director of the New York City's Mayor's Office of City Legislative Affairs, where he spearheaded efforts to pass several landmark laws that have been so important to New York City, including New York City's 20-year solid waste management plan. He was also director of community planning for New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, where he organized coalitions blocking the siting of polluting infrastructure in overburdened communities while revising public waste and energy policies. It's really a pleasure to have him here. I've known Eddie for a long time. He's an award-winning urban planner and community organizer. He's been interviewed by local and national media, and many books have featured his work, including The Battle for Gotham, New York in the Shadow of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs by Roberta Gratz, Noxious New York, The Racial Politics of Urban Health and Environmental Justice by Julie Say, and We Won't Move, Community Planning in the Real Estate Capital of the World by Tom Ignati. Eddie is also a visiting professor at Pratt Institute's graduate programs for sustainable planning and development. So with that, I want to invite Walter Meyer up to speak, and thank you very much.
I know there's probably a lot of landscape architects and people with ecology backgrounds, but I'm going to set a quick primer framework for those without an ecology background, just to discuss the transition that we're in from sustainability to resiliency. And it comes down to that since the beginning of the 20th century, ecologist Fred Clement developed this equilibrium theory in our relationship with nature that essentially established our federal policy in the way we preserve open space is set through preservation rather than conservation. And this is essentially an ecology that's trying to, let's say, plant succession is growing into a forest that is striving to be stable with its environment. And the contrast comes out of in the late 20th century with the disturbance model, which says, rather than a forest trying to become stable with its environment, it's dependent on change, and when change happens, opportunities occur for new species to take over. And this isn't to get into the science of ecology, but really to understand how this uploaded from academia into society and affected our policy. And for almost 20 years, we've been living under the idea of sustainability that came from the UN as a means of distributing resources. And now we're shifting, and it's been discussed for many years, but towards a cultural awakening, towards resiliency in our policy making, as well as in popular culture. And after Sandy, it's kind of jumped on to the front stage of realizing that LEED platinum buildings won't help you survive a hurricane, and solar panels alone aren't going to help you survive unless you have a backup system. So resiliency comes down to a series of decisions that need to be made for distribution of resources. A little bit about myself. I come from a family of wooden boat builders. I've sailed to almost 30 countries, and my understanding of cities is from their ports, from their historic connection to the ocean. And on one of these trips, sailing across to Portugal from Rhode Island as a teenager, we came across and hit the Sargasso Sea, which is basically where all the currents meet. And normally that would be a habitat of floating seaweed and such, but in this case it was an island of plastic and garbage, known as the Atlantic Gyre. But we had to drift backwards for 3 days to get out of that, and it was kind of impacted my understanding of cities and seas, and they're very directly correlated. And I focused my research in undergrad and at the GSD on retrofitting urban infrastructure to help clean the oceans and the reefs that I've seen decay in my short childhood. I want to dive into disturbance real quick from notes in the field. There's two types of disturbances. You have man-made or anthropogenic, and then you have natural forces, atmospheric and the sort, hurricanes and such. And so I want to dive into man-made for a second. So a man-made disturbance would include like pollution, right? In this case, this is the entrance to Miami, where this is where all the cruise ships come through. High degree of pollutants come out this government cut. A lot of the corals have been in decay, as you would expect. But there's this one species of coral that a Dr. Colin Ford out of the University of Miami Rosenstiel School of Marine Sciences is analyzing at why it's flourishing in this very intense environment. And they think it's a case of punctuated equilibrium, which is essentially questions the gradient theory of adaptation and says things happen in leaps and bounds under different disturbances. So here we have a pollution disturbance that causes this coral to flourish when others are dying. They're not sure what it is or where it's going, but you can imagine how that would be a device for coastal infrastructure, right? So now we jump into this thing called biorock, which is essentially, and this is a piece that I'm holding, that we grew in 2 years in a canal in Key Largo. Essentially, you put a chicken wire in the water, and you put a low voltage current, and accelerates the coral reef growth, but essentially makes a self-healing concrete. And so you imagine a foundation of this with some of these quickly adapted species living on its surface as a means of deploying inexpensive infrastructure along our coastlines. So leaving the anthropogenic disturbances, we're going to dive into atmospheric disturbances. Out in the field, our work has been, we've been building stuff in Africa, in the Caribbean, South America. One thing we see that's the same is that plant species in the tropics have these 4 ways of dealing with disturbances, atmospheric disturbances. They either react by being slim, limber, brittle, or rigid. So we're going to look at slim. This is what's called a hurricane palm in the Caribbean, Roystonia elata. Fairly beautiful species, but as soon as the wind blows over 50 knots, it starts to drop its leaves and becomes stiff and aerodynamic. And after the storm passes, it quickly grows back out. In contrast, the coconut palm, or Cocos nucifera, becomes limber in a storm, bends with it up to 90 degrees, but holds all of its leaves. As soon as the storm passes, it's as if nothing happened. A third reaction is brittle. This is a mahogany species. So the mahogany is brittle, and the leaves and branches collapse at a fairly low wind speed, and those branches become fertilizer for the regrowth quickly after the storm. And the last one is rigid. This is a live oak species. It's one of the hardest species in the southern states. This is a photo in Waveland, Mississippi, after Katrina came ashore, and you see the hard infrastructure of the house has disappeared, and the only thing standing are these sentinel species of live oak. And the reason I'm showing you this is not to dive into botanics. It's to show you these systems that, when applied at the urban scale, become living infrastructure mechanisms for resilient design. This is a project that we built and started construction in 2007. We designed in 2006 and was opened in 2010. This is the 3rd largest city in Puerto Rico, the city of Mayagüez. For the Central American Games, it was a commission for both the governor of Puerto Rico and the city of Mayagüez mayor to bring a rare situation where the Spanish have a law of the old Spanish control of the island, had a rule of having a defense zone, a maritime defense zone where no private property could own. It was a rare opportunity where there was a large swath, 2 miles long of city edge that could be restructured. We brought to the group the idea of doing first an ecological membrane and then fold into it all the program that the client wanted, active recreation and places for opening ceremonies of the Central American Games. But essentially, we studied virgin rivers in Puerto Rico, and there's thankfully a couple left in the Northeast Ecological Corridor. And we studied 3 important lessons, not out of something nihilistic or out of nostalgia, We were not trying to restore virgin rivers in an urban area. The real estate pressures are too high. What we're doing is extracting from the pre-Columbian nature what ecological services could apply in an efficient manner with respect to real estate. So what we studied was the first lesson is that the rivers, when they approach the sea, the curve increases and it cools down the water, slows it down. The second lesson in Puerto Rico and a lot of Caribbean islands is that there's a lot of roots in the water pulling out all of the nitrogen and phosphorus through a process that we know is phytoremediation in a controlled environment, but in this case, just the way the forest interacts. The third and critical lesson is that there's a dynamic dune system that changes with each storm and is a final polishing membrane between all of these organics that are poisonous to the reef and the ocean. So see how clear the water is in this aerial versus the river. So when phosphorus gets onto a coral reef, it causes algae growth, which doesn't allow the sun to get to the coral polyps, and they eventually die. And then oxygen is sucked out of the water, and then the species start to collapse, the fish, marine species. So we brought this system in 3 parts into the CSO discharge points in the river. And in the cross-section from city to sea, what was mostly a post-industrial landscape of solid concrete, we chipped up and recycled the concrete and established a phytoremediation wetland, and then with the cut, put a fill of a dune system, which would have existed in this form 500 years ago, but was now used a place for dumping old cars and building things. Within the phytoremediation system, we use tools that are conventional for landscape architects for phytoremediation, which is primary treatment of sediments, secondary treatment through bacteria that live in the root zone of these native species, and tertiary treatment in the sand polishing bed of the dunes. We had to liaison with Army Corps of Engineers on sand replenishment. Typically, a sand beach is usually loaded in a parallel form through heavy equipment, fossil fuels. But by do a point load and use the littoral drift of the sand, we're able to have the front of this big dune, which will be built in a later phase, scour and move naturally, so that after a hurricane, it's actually something cleansing, something beautiful, and not a lot of work to do with construction fences and all that. But while the front of this dune is completely dynamic, the back of it is somewhat static, a hybrid, in the sense that there's a coastal forest with very aggressive roots that hold it intact, and some geogrid, and then a transition to a hard sheet pile wall along the Malecon or the waterfront road. Now, when designing a phytoremediation system for resiliency, it's a little different than just designing for pollution. Of course, in a light rain, it can handle these benthic species, and these littoral species can handle petroleum loads. And if we get heavy metals, we had a different type of plant species that was used there. But the soft and hard infrastructure are both combined to handle storm surge inundation, because we had to model this this entire 2-mile coast for a tsunami inundation, and it was required by the Tsunami Center, the Caribbean Tsunami Center, for after impact where positive drainage would occur if the storm sewers failed. And that's because of potential cholera outbreaks after 3 weeks of bacteria. And this last slide for the project shows the pre-development before the park was built, when we started the project. And you can see how the Mayaguez Bay, its particulate load, didn't have much oxygen, and there were not any migratory fish. What was left of the coral reef was mostly white skeletons with algae-covered surface. And you can see in the construction photo after, you can see the bottom, and it's now been open for 2.5 seasons. And you can see the CSO pipes come in at each street end and have both toilet water and street water in it. But they come through into the wetlands and are integrated into the open space through primary, secondary, and tertiary treatment. You can see here primary, secondary, tertiary, final polishing behind the dunes. The congresswoman from our district, where our office is in Brooklyn, Nydia Velasquez, got excited about Mayagüez, and she got excited about this other idea. We said, okay, if we can do this in Puerto Rico, at the time that we designed it, it was illegal to do in New York City. But things have changed, and the legislation is catching up with sustainable technology. So things are wide open after the storm. Even DEC is open to changing their laws from preservation-based to creation-based measurements. So we said, how would you pull this off in the real estate pressures of New York City, which are much higher than a waterfront in Puerto Rico? So we said, okay, we mount these on a barge. This is more than a typical floating wetland. It's simply take a marine barge that can be moved around quickly by a tugboat, a water ballast to keep the positive drainage through the wetlands at 5%, which you need to minimize pumping and increase efficiency, and then a 500 million gallon cistern, which represents about a half hour of discharge from an average size CSO pipe in New York City. The pipe, this is a half hour of discharge, gets treated over 3 days in a series of wetland habitats that would be hot swappable, meaning if this barge was going to sit for one summer on one CSO pipe that had mostly heavy metals, we're going to have a different set of poplars and such versus another pipe for the next season that may have petroleum, and we'll have more Spartina and such. What's interesting about the comparison in temperate constructed wetlands versus tropical is in the temperate environment, we get about 4 gallons per hour of treatment per square foot. But in the tropics, we get 6 to almost 8 gallons, and that's because the metabolic rates are very high in the tropics year-round. There's a lot of sun and everything's active. So in New York, this would be designed for the 6 months of warmth. We're currently planning, and in 6 months we'll have shovels in the ground for a climate resilient based community in East Hampton. It's a kind of eco-luxury product, but essentially you buy a house, it comes with a Tesla that charges the house when the power goes down. But when the power is up, you're grid connected with solar panels that are picking up solar thermal energy. The wastewater is used for geothermal, and when there's not enough wastewater flow, it taps into either a pond or the 30-foot deep supply wells. So we're trying to increase efficiency of existing technologies, but integrating landscape into the wastewater system to reuse for irrigation. And this will be built in about 6 months. We're going through entitlements now. This is a cross-section. We're jumping down to Rockaway Beach, and there's been some interesting interrelationships between the vertical and horizontal social structures. Occupy Sandy was in Rockaway after the storm, and we got involved as a personal and professional engagement. At first, as personal, we used to live there on and off, and then we had lost one friend to the storm, and several others lost their homes. So it was for a month, we devoted our firm's resources to the response there, both in mapping and helping the NGOs on the ground and the CBOs as Occupy Sandy. For the first time, Doctors Without Borders deployed in America, which is incredible. Engineers Without Borders, we liaised with Cameron Sinclair and Architecture for Humanity. A lot of NGOs, a lot of CBOs, community-based organizations on the ground. But the cross-section through Rockaway Beach is you have the ocean, you have the dune, you have a primary dune, secondary dune, a wetland bog that's trying to restore itself at the moment, and then the salt marsh. This is an important cross-section because this is the forensic ecology, and it's currently trying to restore these patterns as we speak. You can analyze this is a LiDAR of a south shore of Long Island, and you can see the dune structure of undeveloped, it's called the Sunken Forest. It was the last pre-Columbian forest in Long Island. And it's important to study these pre-Columbian conditions for lessons learned for ecological services for living with the sea. But in the developed area next to it, you can see the remnants of the primary dune, the swale, the secondary dune, remnants of the organs, the rainwater organs. And then the last of the ridges have been sorted out into pads above flood elevation for the bungalows in Fire Island. Now, what the meteorologists in looking at Sandy mostly focus on the impact of the storm and its merging with a cold front, but wasn't looked at the big picture as an unprecedented wind field that came all the way from England up to Rockaway Beach. So you had an incredible amount of swell piling up, which is why the storm surge was larger than expected. Add to that, why was a Category 1 storm having this biblical flood? It's just this big funnel in the New York Bight, which bends towards Rockaway and then takes a turn into the harbor. So a lot of the majority of the focus of the flood was on Rockaway Beach. Add to that the man-made disturbance of concentration of poverty. Between the South Bronx and Rockaways, you have some of the highest concentration of poverty and affordable housing projects on the far end of the Rockaways. And Breezy Point gets a lot of the attention, but a lot of the work in terms of economic vulnerability and ecologic vulnerability is from the center over. And Rockaways is a barometer of vulnerability from upper middle class to some of the most vulnerable economically. At the peak of the storm, there were 3-story waves that you see in this data feed. This is in meters, so this is over 35, 33 feet. And this is taken an hour before the storm came ashore in Rockaway Beach. Right after sunset, this boardwalk was lifted and impacted all the front row of houses. And this was the largest data, measurements ever taken in New York Harbor, ever, or for hundreds of years of measurements. And these were, the effects of the swell against the bathymetry are focused by these valley lines offshore, and they correlate with hot spots of damage on the peninsula. You start with Arvern East, heavily impacted. Arvern neighborhood has a shoal offshore, and the developer gets a lot of credit for filling the elevation, but there's a lot of other variables, mostly that the waves weren't as high there. The impact, the other hot spot in Army Corps parlance was from the surfing neighborhood of 90th Street going to Bell Harbor. Major impact, and a lot of the structural damage is in here, and that's where a lot of this offshore bathymetry comes in. And then a kind of double barrel that happened over here for Breezy Point. But Jacob Riis Park, the national park, wasn't structurally impacted the way other parts were. So there's a lot of variables to look at in the big picture and the small picture. And these same seams come up into the land. So what we know of Rockaway Beach is the tip of the iceberg of a larger system that accumulates a planetary energy of this swell. And only Rockaway Beach gets this planetary force and this economic force of the city meet at the margin of sand, which is Rockaway Beach. Now there's some opportunities in the technology of what the Dutch are doing with these sand motors and artificial reefs in Australia. But on the ground here, there's historically islands that have formed off of Rockaway, come and gone. Because between Montauk and New Jersey, there's not much sand because it all collects into Rockaway like a big scoop. So we're sand rich in Rockaways. And all the sand that was on the beach migrated to offshore. Being a surfer and a sailor, I've spent time after Sandy out in the water, and there's been a lot of shoaling out here. This is Hog Island, a former island that was offshore. It was actually inhabited right before the Great Depression. Hotels and casinos and houses. So this is Rockaway Beach shore, and these bridges that connected offshore. So islands have come and gone through the years. There's some that are forming off Breezy Point, but Army Corps pumps the sand and tries to stop it. So what we're advising is to try to bend these forces rather than stop them and use that resource in other ways. In the Gold Coast of Australia, we have these reefs that are sandbag reefs, geotubes, and the issue is scale. The most successful ones were large, and the smaller ones kind of failed. But they build a salient, a buffer of reef there. Whoops. This is a sand dune that collapsed after the storm, just with grass, and one with heterogeneous planting of pitch pine and other species. Again, lessons on heterogeneity, how this tree split waves and protected houses behind it in Rockaway, whereas just dune grass and sand alone, the way Army Corps normally builds, is not the way to go moving forward. This is a cross-section through existing Rockaway Beach, 91st Street. This is a condo. The boardwalk is wiped out. What's left is a concrete skeleton and all the active use. One kind of pilot project is saying, let's move the primary dune on top of that old skeleton and allow the roots to lock into that. Oh, shoot, sorry. Oh, boy. Sorry, guys. Wrapping up here. But that it becomes a living infrastructure on top of leveraging the existing hard infrastructure. Shift the boardwalk back and introduce pitch pine and black locust species, which are extremely salt tolerant, as the back dune for the 500-year flood protection. and with the option of a sheet pile wall embedded underneath. So it's at a cost of about $15 million a mile for this system. And then right after the storm, we hadn't heard from friends for a couple of days, so we went in with a truckload of solar panels that some solar engineers from a nonprofit called Solar One, they build these with students, so you can see these rough around the edges kind of panels. But we had them laying around, and we had these old granny shopping carts and batteries. We set them up, and immediately people were lining up to charge their phones and call their family and let them know they were still alive. And we started to ramp that up once we saw the need, that this is larger than any government or NGO can handle at the scale of this disaster. So we called favors and got construction-grade solar generators to be installed at a dozen different sites, and then scaled up even further 3 weeks later and started a crowdsourced fundraising called Power Rocket Resilience. So that's all. Thank you.
Maybe I'm not having the water, yeah. I don't want to ruin Gund Hall and leave it worse, or Piper worse than I came. Never get invited back. Okay, I'm Abby Sucko, and I just wanted to share with you. I have sat, obviously, because I'm an alumni, many times in this room listening to lots of lectures, and most of the time people talk about projects they've actually completed. And so your job as a student is to listen and kind of take it in and then maybe use some of the information. In this situation, I was completely thrilled to come up here because this is the first time that I've been in a, well, it's happening in real time, and we're all part of the design solution as well as the discussion. So not only as future design professionals, but also as citizens. And it's messy, it's complicated, there's lots of people, everybody's got a slightly different agenda, and it's gonna take a while to filter it all out. But this is the way the world is changing, and we have to focus on it. So I'm gonna share with you some of what is going on in New York right now and try to set it up a little bit for you. And I want you to look at two images. This is Manhattan from, the first one is 1609. For those of you who are not familiar with the Manhattan Project, it's actually Eric Sanderson and the Wildlife Conservation Society. And for reasons that are not clear to me, they decided it'd be really good to look at New York if no one came. So they made what they call the broccoli maps. And it's a really incredible Photoshop extravaganza. There's an unbelievable model, a great book, and that's what it used to be. On the right, Ewan Bond, who is like the killer photographer these days, rented a helicopter, I heard from Tom Main, and on November 1st, he found like the only helicopter flying, and he flew around, got the picture, and it was the cover of New York Magazine. Okay, the only other time that those of us in memory can recall the design community in New York coming together was basically after 9/11. So the question becomes, we all said to each other, what do you do September 12th? There was a lot of chitter-chatter. There's about 20-odd design organizations in New York City. Each one has a slightly different mission. Many of the people are the same people. And at the time, we formed a coalition called New York New Visions, of which somehow 400 people participated. Some of those people, pretty much everybody is doing Sandy something or other right now. There's reports being written, there's conferences being had. I've tried to, make it like the red, white, and blue thing, but there's a big AIA-led report that's blue. There's some that are doing both things, and then there's some that are doing their own thing. But, okay. My contribution to the 9/11 was actually to make a map, which Joyce was kind enough to mention. For reasons that are not clear to me, my colleague, Diana Pardue, who actually's day job is managing the Statue of Liberty, and its collection inside, for some reason, ran out of paper maps that we had actually last printed in 2006. And it bothered her enough for her to send me an email because she needed more. Okay, so I think maybe our map is important This is the one this is basically the cultural and historical map of downtown, and its claim to fame is we printed 500,000 and put them everywhere, so it was really what everybody used for planning. And we put every piece of information you could possibly think was good for planning or getting people back downtown on the map so they'd all have one document to talk about. I think that's really important. Now, the discussion about storm surge actually starts in a big way with the Guy Nordenson, Catherine Sivat, and Adam Urinsky's project, which is basically this on the water, sea level rise in the Palisades Bay, and they do a very thorough study of it. Most of the people at the time when it was all presented thought that the sea level rise was going to be 2 to 4 feet, and even then not, in 40 years or something like that. So that's what got folded into the plans. They had talked about the 500-year, and this is sort of their diagram of what it might be, which is kind of what happened. So, but it really, this is from, the book was published 2009. What it led to was the Rising Current exhibition, and for those of you who, it's become more chatter now, this is when soft infrastructure comes in, and that's what people talk about. Okay, what happens October 29th? This is the storm, and then this is actually the evacuation zones. There was some mapping, a lot of maps were made. I'm sharing with you, I happen to have the good or bad fortune to have been around at the inception, or possibly, I was vice president of the AIA in New York for 3 years, and I've just timed out and been promoted to New York State, which may not be a promotion, but anyway. We put a design for risk committee together, and the design, at the time we were all kind of concerned because the Japan happened, and then Haiti happened, and so neither of these places are in New York, and there were all these people in New York who were desperate to go build projects in Haiti, and the whole thing blew up, and we said, well, we're New Yorkers, people in Florida could do that, so maybe we should have a committee. So we put this risk committee together, and one of the members, Richard Gonzalez, who actually is affiliated with Columbia, had access to all of these maps. He made these maps, they're GIS maps, and I think what you do is you filter, you dump the information in and filter in what you want. So, and then you dress up the graphics. So he did about 10 of them, and you could probably I can't really read them from here because it's not as in focus, but it's high risk zones, there's the FEMA flood risks. He didn't really check the data, which you probably should be doing, but I just put them in. It's really Columbia stuff. I have a feeling you could do the same thing at GSD, because you probably have the same sources, which is where it came from, and I think it's all public. So this just happens to be what we had. Okay, let's go back to Mannahatta. This is what it was after all the study, and I put this in because I want you to look at the next major map in New York City, which is the Commissioner's Grid of 1811. Now, this was originally made, at the time, everyone was living at Lower Manhattan, and they were a very optimistic community, and they had a lot of health problems, and they thought they were going to be a bigger city. So this is when they decide to grid the island, okay? And it's had its 200-year anniversary. If you look at the angles on the grid, you're going to see the sea change. Okay, first of all, Manhattan is not flat. Second of all, this is the next major map, which is the Viale Map. The engineers use it all the time because it actually shows what was originally below, and so it's really good for foundations. If you want to look at better map sites, I want to show you Oasis, which is actually CUNY's map. You can do mashups, and you can put the old maps on all sorts of things now. I want to show you very briefly This is one that I did, which is actually what's along the water's edge in Manhattan. I just want to show some of the architectural sites. We did it for the architectural boat tour. People asked why there was so much housing. There was so much housing because there were a lot of poor people, there's a lot of health problems, and the rich people lived on Fifth Avenue. So there's just tons of public housing in all permutations. The reason that there were two projects of interest on the East River, River House, which was built really fancy because they couldn't get anyone to go there, and Tudor City, I want you to look at because the sign, there's no windows on the water, because that's where it was an industrial waterfront. You just didn't want to live there. The UN comes, everything changes, and suddenly people are interested in living on the water. The hospitals start because of Bellevue, which was the original cure for disease was basically light and air, and you put someone in a nice place not too far away. It was done in 1736. This becomes Bedpan Alley. And people ask, why were they on the water? This is why. Okay, the working waterfront to the recreational one, this is where Bloomberg planning thing comes up, and you'll see it as it gets knitted together. I put a few projects in. John Nouvel, Brooklyn Bridge Park, Jane's Carousel, it's back now, but you could see what happened. Okay, this is my 10 design principles. I made 10 because I thought it was a good number. Okay? Number 1, Riverside Park, 12 o'clock, the day of the thing. These are New York City's idea of closing off the park was that you tie the trees with caution tape. These are our neighbors. Okay? Number 2, who knew? Number 3, the only thing that you felt sorry for people who lived in Tribeca, is all I can say. New Jersey and New York are now trying to figure out great ways for people to do projects together. I cannot tell you how many meetings there are between appropriate government agencies. Okay. What the people in Staten, I put this in because all the people in Staten Island went crazy because they were told to go on the internet and fill out forms. Well, this is a little problem. Okay, the bike lanes. Everybody hated that. People like the bike lanes in concept. There are now 200 miles of them. The problem is New Yorkers do not know how to ride bikes, and they take up a lot of space. And so pretty much everybody who drove got concerned. So you didn't know if it was going to outlast Bloomberg or not. Well, now it is. Okay, water finds its original shoreline. That basically, if you look at the old maps, you're going to see that's what happened. Now, who knew? This was checked not that long before, unfortunately, the wind was a little high. And as you know, hotels were evacuated. 57th Street was basically taken out of service. This is, by the way, the Ponson Park building, which is now going to be the highest high-rise in New York for residential. Okay, backup systems. I have worked on hospitals in New York City, and there have been tons of meetings about backups and resiliency and support and everything. I can assure you that they thought it would work. Okay, let's talk about Mother Nature. There's some people there's a lot of issues about, do we take the Dutch system? Do we, put the big barriers in? Who's going to be behind the barrier? Who's going to be in front of the barrier? How much is it going to cost? This is all up in the air. The other part of this thing is New York used to be, the harbor was full of oysters and all sorts of things because it was kind of thicker in its olden days. So I put the oyster picture in because there's been a lot of thought about putting more oysters in now. Okay, I know it's Goldman Sachs, but 45,000 sandbags and a guy with a mop did wonders. And in the end, that's a lot cheaper than some other solutions. Okay, this is my big takeaway, is that you really should, if you bankrupt them, it's kind of pointless. And the other thing is I made this really, really small, and the reason is there's so much happening right now. All of it is in real time, and all of it is, I probably missed 3/4 of the things now going on. You can find it, you can participate. I also put a picture of Arvine because as of yesterday, they are about to do a design competition for it, very much like Via Verde. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Abby, for those principles. Those were great, and thanks for inviting me here. My name's Thaddeus Pulaski. I'm an urban designer for the Department of City Planning in New York, but since November, I've been working as a special advisor to the Mayor's Office of Housing Recovery. I'm working for a gentleman there named Brad Gare, who's the Mayor's point person on housing recovery. And Brad's a very good leader for this time. He's been through a lot of disasters before. He was New York's FEMA's point person after 9/11. And then he also went to Katrina and was in charge of housing operations there. So he's seen how these things can be done well and how they can be done badly. And so he's bringing lots of those lessons now. So Brad's mission is to get every New Yorker that was displaced by Sandy back into a permanent housing solution by the end of the year. And my job is to be the person from city planning sitting in the cubicle a few down from his and making sure that whatever happens during that time makes sense for our long-term strategic goals for city planning, makes sense from a land use point of view, and is well coordinated with the years of community planning efforts and that will be going on as these neighborhoods struggle to recover. So we're all very busy right now, and we've all been playing many different roles. But we've been actually working on recovery since long before the storm, and I think that's probably the most important lesson, is that we could have done more in that world, and we will now. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about some of the recovery, the pre-disaster recovery, or we might call it mitigation, that we've done. So I started working for the city in 2006, or 2005, actually, working on the coastal storm plan for New York City, which was a reaction to what we saw happen in New Orleans after Katrina. We realized that the city was not as well prepared as it should be, and we feared that we would be subject to the same kind of lack of preparation that we saw the consequences of in Katrina. So we developed a coastal storm plan, and it was a very sophisticated way of evacuating the city, making maps that showed where people should evacuate, how we would shelter people after the storm, and how we would clean up debris. All of that we saw put into place after Sandy, and lots of it we saw put into place after Irene. The coastal storm plan, I think, as a, not speaking as a government person, but just as a New Yorker, I think was very successful. But I realized as an architect working for OEM in 2006 when we wrote the plan that we had a great plan for sheltering people right after a storm, but we really didn't know where people would go after the few days of disaster. So we thought, or I thought as an architect, that this is a design problem. We need to think about ways to reestablish housing, temporary housing in the cities, some alternative to a FEMA trailer, because we knew that FEMA trailers wouldn't work in New York City because of the density and because of the climate and because of just because we care about our neighborhoods and we wouldn't want them to be eroded with something that is inappropriate as that. So we put the challenge out there to designers. We worked with New York, with Architecture for Humanity, and the Rockefeller Foundation, and we asked architects, designers, planners to think about how would the city recover, and we developed this hypothetical neighborhood we call the Prospect Shore, and actually we made this neighborhood by cutting up all the waterfront, 12 different waterfront communities in New York and stitching them back together, and we subjected it to storm, and the result of the competition was that it was entered by 130 different designers, and the solution that they came up with over and over again was the alternative to a FEMA trailer should be modular construction, something that you can build up out of the floodplain, something that you can quickly deploy to a site, something that can be prefabricated ready before the storm. And so we developed this idea further with the Department of Design and Construction, wrote a technical manual for how these modules could be built, worked with some industries, some put an RFQ out to builders to see if the industry could ever support this. And that I left OEM and I went to go work for city planning, and I at city planning worked to write an urban design manual for how we would place these things in neighborhoods that would respect the character of neighborhoods, and also think about the regulatory and community planning process that would be involved in the creation of these. So after Sandy, I was fully ready to go out there and start doing this. But of course, we didn't have the modules ready. But nevertheless, a group of us from city planning and we worked with volunteers from the AIA and the Pratt Center started to go out to neighborhoods and think about what available land would be ready for sites for these. But it was interesting to me to learn that the principle was actually more important than the actual product here, because the principle that we established in our thinking about these modular units and how they would keep neighborhoods together, the key principle is that we wanted to keep people close to home so that they could be participating in the recovery, and that we could keep their networks together, and we could help them figure out what they wanted to do in the longer term. So after Sandy, there was a decision made that the city should focus its resources on another completely new and innovative strategy, which is something called rapid repairs. And basically, rapid repairs shelters the displaced population in place, meaning it restores the basic services to individual homeowners. So I think, I'm not quite sure of the number, but I believe 14,000 or thereabouts people have registered for rapid repairs so far. Many of those are complete, and it's been it's a new program. It's never been done before. It's had ups and downs, but I think the overwhelming consensus is that it's been quite successful. And by keeping people so close to home that they're actually in their home, we haven't had to resort to any other kind of temporary housing measure. Not for this storm, but I think this is still a valid idea, and all ideas have been on the table through the course of this, working at the Housing Recovery Office. I've seen that we've taken a very open-minded approach to all potential solutions and evaluated them very closely with representatives from the communities, and with trying to think through the best solution for each moment of the disaster. So this one, not for this disaster, but I think it still might be a viable option for another. A little bit more about what we did before the storm is that we imagined that the city would go through a gradual adaptation to higher flood elevations. Or I guess we optimistically fantasize that could be the case, but instead, because of Sandy, we're going through a rapid evolution, an accelerated evolution to higher standards of flood protection. So last year, the RPA and Regional Plan Association and City Planning and a few other partners received a grant from HUD for Sustainable Communities, and through that grant we were able to begin to study the urban design and zoning implications of greater flood protection for buildings. We've been calling this the freeboard study. Freeboard is basically, it refers to a measure of safety above where you expect the water to go, so that you can be sure that your house or other space is protected from the storm. Now, this elevation of usable space above the ground is a real challenge for New York City, where so much depends on our vibrant street life. So we knew we had to study this very carefully. And first of all, the regulations are not simple. This is a diagram that makes it look somewhat simple, but so we had to gain a common understanding with the design community and with just even in between a state, local, and federal government perspective, what are the appropriate flood protections that we require either in Appendix G of the New York City Building Code or through the National Flood Insurance Program design requirements. And so we educated ourselves. And thank God we did, because all of this has become quite important now as we negotiate the regulations and help people try to rebuild after Sandy. So this diagram shows basically there are two different kinds of flood zones per FEMA regulations, A zones and V zones. And in V zones, which we only had a few houses in V zones before Sandy, you can't build any occupiable space below the base flood elevation. Anything that's in that zone has to be able to break away with storm surge. It's called V zone because it's wave velocity. This is where the water can actually compromise structures. The A zone is what is often called the 1 in 100 year flood zone. Here you have two options. You can either keep the water out, that's called dry flood proofing, that's storm gates or those sandbags around Goldman Sachs, that would be a form of dry flood proofing, or wet flood proof, which means let the water through and make the just mop it up afterward. Wet flood proofing is not allowed for residential units per Sandy or per FEMA, and in the wake of Sandy, that's something that we're kind of concerned about, because most of New York City is built. Most of it is built most of that which is built within the flood zones it has residential units at the ground floor. So we want to be thinking about whether or not this regulation makes sense for New York City in the long term, but it's probably a conversation that's going to happen in many places over many months in the future. So we studied how those regulations play out for different types of New York City buildings, and we did this last year. We looked at things like street wall requirements in our zoning text. We want to be able to encourage like an active, continuous pedestrian experience, and what would it mean if we started to have blank walls and higher stoops. And we studied it with the design community. We had a charrette at the AIA. We're having another charrette with the AIA on Saturday. The AIA is great at helping the city think through these problems visually, and the charrettes are actually very useful. And this was one we had last year. And what that charrette last year really helped to do didn't give us the prototypical perfect building for the flood zone, but it did help to establish our principles, and those are that when we build to these new elevations, we want to protect neighborhood character. We want to maintain visual connectivity between occupied space in the building and the public realm. We want to encourage dynamic and innovative architecture, and we want to create inviting access ways into buildings. So, after the storm, FEMA issued new advisory-based flood elevations, which and they were, our old flood maps were based on outdated information. Our new flood maps are much more stringent. Buildings are going to have to raise much higher. So in order for people to start rebuilding, we had to reconsider some provisions in the zoning resolution to allow people to build back the same house that they had before. So the mayor signed this executive order. It's not the way that zoning is usually done in New York City. As I'm sure most of you know, we have a public review process for zoning, but the mayor did this by executive order to help people get back into their houses. We will be introducing another round of zoning to make this a permanent part of our zoning resolution if it passes through all the appropriate consultations with the community and political framework. So, and as we do that, we want to think about other ways to, make our city more ready for the next storm, but at the same time preserve the quality of urban design and community cohesiveness that makes New York such a great place to live. So this was an image we just made for Prospect Shore. You know, Prospect Shore has been our laboratory for thinking through this. I'm glad we had a laboratory to at least establish our principles, and now we're going to be working together for the next few years to figure out the next steps. So maybe in the discussion I could talk a little bit more about what some of those next steps are. But thanks very much again for having me.
Good evening, folks. I want to thank Joyce and the GSD for inviting me to come speak today. It's an honor, but it's also it was a decision without not. It wasn't a. It was a decision of some controversy in my house. Our son just graduated from Yale last year, and when I told him I was coming to talk to the GSD, he kind of gagged. And I'm gonna be returning right after this panel just to make sure that the locks aren't changed by the time I get home. So as Joyce mentioned, I'm the executive director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. It's a citywide coalition of community-based organizations from New York City's most environmentally overburdened communities. We were founded in 1991. It was at a time when the New York City's environmental justice movement was just taking off. A number of our neighborhood groups had gotten pretty good at some of the site battles that they were fighting, but what became clear was that there were overarching city and state and even federal policies that were leading to these clusters and concentrations of not just environmental burdens, but lack of environmental amenities. And it became clear that we needed to join together as an alliance to address what were systemic problems that we were facing in our communities. In some ways, it's almost like the Avengers, right? Like those fights that Thor and Hulk can't fight alone; they join together. You know, that joke falls flat every time. I'm gonna stop. I'm just gonna stop doing it. Okay. So this is a map of where our members come from. Our members from top to bottom, from the South Bronx. Our members are Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, Sustainable South Bronx, and Nos Quedamos. From the west side of Manhattan, it's a Morningside Heights West Harlem Sanitation Coalition, and in Brooklyn, it's El Puente and Uprose. Those red outlines that you see constitute what are designations under the city's waterfront revitalization program. It's the city's version of the Coastal Zone Management Plan, and those red contours reflect what's known as significant maritime and industrial areas. Essentially, New York City's Coastal Zone Management Plan, very similar to most other cities' coastal zone management plans, breaks up the city's waterfront uses and measures applications for uses along the waterfront based on what the allowed uses are. So you have four basic categories. You have the working waterfront, of which the significant maritime and industrial areas are a subset. There's the natural waterfront. Yeah, we still have wetlands in New York. We have the recreational waterfront, and a euphemism for the housing and gentrification of our waterfronts. We call the redeveloping waterfront. Our connection to Sandy actually goes back to the 90s. Our concern back in the late 90s, when New York City first updated its waterfront revitalization program, was this introduction of these concepts called significant maritime and industrial areas. These are, by its designation on its face, these are essentially industrial retention policies, right? And much to some people's surprise, at least in New York City, the environmental justice movement is not an anti-industrial movement. We're as much industrial retention advocates as a lot of other entities in our city. In fact, from our perspective, we need the industrial retention policies, because if you look at the job opportunities that are available for communities, then some of our neighborhoods are not. A lot of our neighborhoods are not college bound, and so in terms of being able to have a living wage, when you compare the average annual salary from the manufacturing sector in New York City, based on studies by the New York City Economic Development Corporation, the average annual salary of manufacturing jobs is about $60,000 a year. Not a bad choice when the alternatives are, service delivery jobs and other kind of low-wage jobs. But from our perspective, the notion that industrial retention means compromised environmental quality, that's an old paradigm, and that's something we just don't truck with that. Our sense is that environmental protection and economic development can't be and should not be at odds, and that in fact we can advocate for industrial retention while at the same time be staunch defenders of our environmental quality. So when the city launched these significant maritime industrial areas, there was a certain ambivalence because again we were industrial retention advocates, but there was no environmental quality controls in any of those designations. There was no attempt to anticipate what the clustering and concentration of industrial uses means when you have those kinds of designations on these communities. So we began an SMIAs of significant maritime industrial areas. So we started an SMIA reform campaign, but those of you who know who was running New York City in the late 90s, the Giuliani administration, there was one area the only thing they were more hostile to than environmental protection was civil rights, and you combine those two, and it was just a no-brainer. So we didn't win that campaign. But then fast forward 2010, the Bloomberg administration relaunches its update of the whole waterfront revitalization program. So we figure a more enlightened administration that gets environmental protection and sustainability, and on some level civil rights, we might be able to get some traction. So we started looking at these SMIAs, but what we had in 2010 that we didn't have in the late 90s was climate change sensibility and storm surge projections. This map shows, and to our kind of horror, right, we started mapping over the SMIAs, the storm surge projections from the New York State Office of Emergency Management. And again, now in hindsight, I guess it's it shouldn't have been a horror to any or a shock to any of us, but what became, scarily clear to us was that every single one of these SMIAs was in a storm surge zone. And forget category 1. I mean, nor'easters and tropical storms, we found all of a sudden all of our communities were in harm's way. And so these are in kind of descending order. A is, there are only 6 of these SMIAs in New York City. A is the South Bronx. B is Newtown Creek, which is the border of Brooklyn and Queens. In fact, it's a federal Superfund site. It's one of the most polluted water bodies in the United States. C is the Brooklyn Navy Yard. D is Red Hook. E is Sunset Park. And F is the North Shore of Staten Island. So we started digging in deeper and started doing further analysis, and we realized that this wasn't an insignificant amount of acreage. I mean, when it drives us crazy when people talk about post-industrial New York. We may not have Dow and kind of multinational petrochemical companies, but we have significant, no pun intended, we have, still what the industrial picture in New York is like now is hundreds of small manufacturers. We don't have the huge kind of footprint that the old, industrial age had for New York. But in fact, when you look at it, we're talking about over 4,000 acres of SMIAs that allows for these kind of uses. This is another land use map, and it just kind of denotes what the different uses are according to the New York City zoning resolution. And so the purple denotes what's left of the city's heavy industrial land uses. But New York is, like a lot of densely populated cities, our uses are, cheek to jowl. I mean, there's no neat segregation of industrial and residential uses. So if you look, at the purple right across the street, the yellow indicates different levels of density of residential housing that's allowed right next to each other. So we started digging in deep, and we started looking at layering over and doing additional mapping where we looked at public databases, environmental databases. And I'm just going to pick the next 6 slides, just look at a handful of these. So for example, in New York State, as in Mass, as in a lot of other states, not just the feds have a Superfund program, but the state has a Superfund program. So we started mapping what our DEC is this New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. We started mapping what were Class 2 Superfund sites, and of course, as you can see, these are the hazardous waste sites that require some public act, some action required because there's some threat to public health. And among the hazardous substances you see associated with Class 2 Superfund sites are, trichloroethylene, PCEs, and chromium. So the next slide shows when you take that mapping to a specific SMIA neighborhood, what it means. This is Newtown Creek, and again, this is not just a federal Superfund site, but the dots that you see surrounding the creek are some of the state-designated Superfund sites that require some public action and mean some sort of public health threat. So, for example, if you look at the 43 sites in New York City, 8 of them, or 19% of these state Superfund sites, are both vulnerable to storm surge and within the Newtown Creek SMIA. And among the uses that we've seen associated in that community, we found a metal fabricator where the presence of trichloroethylene is used in their processes, and that's considered to be a carcinogen, which needs to be handled with extreme caution because there may be no safe level of human exposure. Then we started looking at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, their active chemical bulk and major oil storage facility sites. And these are facilities that that have the capacity to store up to 400,000 gallons of oil. And of course, the hazardous substances associated with some of those uses include the use of benzene, copper cyanide, mercury, and the like. Next slide shows how that translates into the South Bronx SMIA. And as you could see, there's something like 171 of these facilities in New York City, and 18 or 11% of them are vulnerable to storm surges and located within the South Bronx SMIA. And just to kind of put just one more interesting layer onto this dynamic, that black square you see up there is what's known as the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center. It's the nation's largest food distribution center. It's where 70% of the regions, I'm not just talking about New York City, the tri-state region's produce, 70% is handled through that facility. When Sandy hit, the storm surge didn't coincide with high tide for this part of the South Bronx. Had it did, the kinds of impacts that we're talking about, and according to the mayor's office, this whole peninsula would have been overrun. And the kinds of problems and disasters that we've talked about post-Sandy would have paled in comparison to what would have meant to knocking out the region's top food distribution center. This next slide is the EPA's Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, the TRI Toxic Release Inventory sites, and of course some of the substances that are associated with industries that are identified by the TRI database are N-hexane, naphthalene, and acetone. And so when you drill down further and you look at another SMIA, you look at Sunset Park, for example. For Sunset Park, there are 234 facilities in New York City. 17 or 7% of them are located within the Sunset Park SMIA and are also vulnerable to storm surges. So for us, it meant that we're looking at a clear and present danger when you're clustering the heaviest chemical and infrastructure uses in the city smack path in the path of potential storm surges. It's the kind of urban design problem that nobody anticipated. And if we were designing a city from scratch, of course we would design a city differently. But this is the hand we were dealt. And so from 2010 through 2013, we've been hammering away, and not just at the city of New York, but state and federal agencies as well. And to their credit, the city of New York, when we started pointing out these vulnerabilities, as they started updating the waterfront revitalization program, we started seeing additional language that was inserted to ensure that we looked at more resilience, more adaptation and resiliency minded strategies for new applications that get cited in the SMIAs. To give you a sense of what the populations are like, this is based on the 2010 census, and what we've come to, based on some of our analysis, approximately 630,000 New Yorkers live in or around the SMIAs and are vulnerable to storm surges. That's larger than the population of Atlanta. Of the 630,000 New Yorkers that live in that proximity, over 433,000 of them are people of color. So there's a direct correlation between race and class and these vulnerabilities. And again, it's not rocket science. Who's going to live closest to the industrial parts of the city? It's going to be people that don't have the same housing options as others. But when you layer on the climate change threats that these communities are faced with, it again calls, you know, a different level of engagement by government to try to figure out not just how do we protect Lower Manhattan and Wall Street, but how do we ensure that these communities that are living with these toxic clusters have their vulnerabilities addressed. This is a slide of the Red Hook, one part of the Red Hook waterfront. As you can tell, this is daylight. This is hours before high tide. This is hours before the worst of Sandy hit. And these are, if any of you guys know Red Hook, these are the Civil War era warehouses. These are warehouses that have been around since the 1860s, and it's fully occupied. These are all, you know, printers. There's a wine shop somewhere in here. These are all basically small manufacturers that, you know, there's nothing nefarious about their business. These are people that are doing their day-to-day, you know, whether it's a metal fabricator or a print shop. But none of them knew that they were in a storm surge zone. I mean, this is not something that was on their radar. And as you can see, this is where usually the bay stops. And I want to say this is like maybe, I don't know, 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. And this is a street, and these are you know, street lights. And when we visited these businesses after Sandy, the watermarks in their businesses were about 8 feet high, and the chemicals were just spilled all over the place. And a lot of them were even afraid for weeks to go back into their own place of business. This is Newtown Creek, and this is the federal Superfund site. So this is also, if you look at, this is usually where the creek stops, and this is a sidewalk. And again, it's daylight and hours ahead, you know, the high tide and the worst of the impacts are still ahead of everyone. What we did was we organized the summit on December 1st to try to get a handle on what this meant for not just the industrially zoned communities, but all the communities that were most hit by Sandy. So we had people from the Lower East Side, from Far Rockaway, from Newark. It was a regional summit, and it was a powerful moment because it was the first time that a lot of these people even left their neighborhoods, right? It was about a month after Sandy hit. And what became clear is that as quickly as the recovery effort was going to move, as quickly as the president had signed the executive order, that if the communities didn't find a way to develop a common regional recovery agenda, a lot of the decision-making and planning was going to be done for them. And, you know, like the environmental justice movement is fond of saying, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. So the whole point of this gathering was to try to figure out how we could start developing our own agenda. What's really interesting, by the way, about when Sandy hit, the Department of City Planning had been taking a lot of our input in terms of increasing resiliency and adaptation interventions in the waterfront revitalization program. But two things to remember. The waterfront revitalization program only speaks to new applications. So the thousands of businesses that are in and around these waterfront areas, none of them, it's an insufficient toolbox. It doesn't reach these folks. And one of the things that we found out post-Sandy is that nearly half of the businesses that were affected by Sandy were industrial firms. So these were not just kind of theoretical mapping exercises for us. A lot of what we had been predicting all along, unfortunately, came true. And this is not the kind of thing that you want to, you know, do I told you so, but it was just, and I guess the ironies abound throughout this whole period, because the day that the city planning department was going to have the city planning commission see its latest version of the waterfront revitalization program, and we didn't know because they had been having hearings and we've been giving our input, but no one had seen the final draft. The day of the hearing that it was scheduled for was October 29th, which was when Sandy hit, which means that they had to cancel the hearing because the subways are shut. So basically, the city's waterfront coastal zone management plan hearing had to be canceled on account of rain, a lot of rain. So just to give you guys a sense of what we're looking at, it's not just the waterfront revitalization program, as I mentioned, but we need to figure out a way to get to the businesses that are there. And what we've been pushing for the last 3 years is identifying some sets of pilot projects where we could take our research, drill down deeper. There are data sets that we don't have access to, and not only us, but other government agencies don't have access to. The fire department has some of the most stringent permitting authority when it comes to all sorts of chemical and oil storage, and not just the state DEC. we found out that the EPA doesn't even have access to that database. And of course, we come knocking, we start hearing Department of Homeland Security concerns and stuff, but our interest is not to necessarily have all that information out publicly, but at the very least, government needs to share that information and put that all in the mix so that we're talking about a single set of vulnerabilities when we're looking at these communities, not guessing which databases we're missing. But from our perspective, it's not just doing the research, but what are the benchmarking mechanisms? What are the operational best practices that these businesses should be reaching for in order to reduce their vulnerabilities? And as I said, a lot of these businesses are small manufacturers. These are not people that are going to have the wherewithal to, sink $40,000, $50,000 in capital infrastructure upgrades, or switch from, some chemical solvent they use to a soy-based material without some sort of federal or state or city support and technical assistance. And finally, for us, it's this question of figuring out what the pilot program would look like, because it's not just identifying the best management practices, but what is that toolbox that both the private and public sectors could join forces to figure out how we can collectively reduce risks for these communities. I'll stop there.
The GSD has graciously allowed us to go a little bit over time, so we are going to have a little bit of time for questions. I want to invite the panelists to sit up here. I'll join you. And I'd like to take a group of questions. Maybe, is there someone with a microphone in case? Thanks. And why don't we take 3 or 4 as a group, and then we can answer them.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you. It was very comprehensive. My question is about an actor that was not mentioned. It's about the insurers, because it's nice to have a design and planning for resilience, but you need to transfer the risk at some point. And I would guess in a lot of cities, and New York included, the insurers are not very keen on continuing what's happening. So I would like to have your perspective on how you engage in your respective work in environment or ecology or planning with insurers. And I would be especially interested from hearing from Walter if you think that ecological principles will make it to planning, and if it could also be a parameter that would be taken into account by insurers when they fix their premiums and they fix their risk quotas. Because they're pulling out of Florida, they're pulling out of LA, they're pulling out, and IFP is in the red, and it's a hot potato. So I would like to hear more about that. Thank you.
Yep. So since we're here at the GSD, my question would be, since you're all very active participants in shaping the negotiation for how we all respond to planning cities, especially like New York after such events like Sandy, I'm wondering, how do you view the kind of imaginations we see coming from designers, the groundedness of them, how they might play out in policy frameworks, regulation, or actually getting enacted, whether they're realistic, and also what are some of the imaginations which are attractive to you for being relevant to this particular situation?
That's a cluster to begin with. Maybe take one more back there. Insurance, ecological principles.
I want to take a simplistic approach. When are we as a community, society, prepared to buy back the land that we've been borrowing from Mother Nature? And are we prepared to pay for it? Because the only long-term solution, once again, from a simplistic point of view, including the insurance thing, is to get off that land. And we're going to have to come up with a way to do that, to pay for it, to relocate those people. Everything else is just temporary. Thank you.
Walter, please.
I'll start with your question. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. The Klaus Jacob is a climate scientist at Columbia who sets an interesting framework of decisions with regards to time to the question of managed retreat. And let's take a sample in Rockaway Beach, which I know well. Klaus Jacob says, 2080 or the next 100 years, it's going to be very difficult to live in Rockaway Beach and most of Zone A, and that Hurricane Sandy was a taste of 2080 twice a day, high tide, right? Twice a day. So there's decisions that have to be made in the 100-year framework. There's another set of decisions in the 50-year framework, and there's decisions in the 20-year, and then there's decisions we should have made before the storm that we can make next week, right? So these soft infrastructure investments and hard infrastructure hybrids get us 20, maybe 50 years, which is their design life. And unfortunately, the ROI on that infrastructure is actually very high, that it looks good on paper to build more land, build more beach, build dunes to protect the tax base that's there. Now, in the big picture, yes, there's a larger vision, Rockaway Beach as a national park with dunes and coastal forests that gets submerged over time and eventually becomes a sandbar, and then Brooklyn is the new ocean front. So that's the long-term reality that we'll have to deal with. But the most important thing, and I'm glad that Eddie Bautista is here, is that like you, I believe in a managed retreat long-term, personally, but I have so many colleagues and friends. I keep my boat in Rockaway Beach. There's a social fabric intact there that needs to be managed in the short term. And so we have to balance, the fact that managed retreat has a dirty history in New York City, not for climatological reasons, but for economic displaced communities that were moved from Manhattan to the Rockaways under the Lindsay administration and Moses and urban renewal. In response to that, in the 70s and 80s, we have the rise of community planning, participatory planning, and then that faded in the 80s and 90s towards materialistic city making based on real estate. And we're seeing, thankfully, hopefully this is permanent, since Sandy, a pop in community-based ground up. At least what I see in the poorest neighborhoods in the community. So you have to balance both.
Just to pick up on the first managed retreat and then the insurers, yeah, totally right. I mean, the managed retreat, it just makes sense, right? I mean, that old definition of insanity, right? You don't keep doing the same thing, expect a different outcome. And I think that for the first time, I mean, Governor Cuomo has said, he's committing some money to buying back, and Christie has kind of waffled in the last week. But I think that there are overtones of bad kind of government interventions when it comes to urban renewal and managed retreat that I've been hearing lately. Oh, they want to buy up the land, and as soon as they get rid of everybody, they're going to build something luxury, and it's so there's that aspect of it that people have, fool me once, shame on you, that whole thing. So I think that government, in terms of managed retreat, has to tread carefully, but probably most importantly, transparently. And that's the opportunity I see them missing right now. The mayor set up something called the Special Initiatives for Recovery and Rebuilding, or something like that. And what they've been doing is they've been having community meetings, and the idea being that they're going to come up with a proposal for the mayor to consider by May. And the backdrop to all this is, the $50 billion in Sandy recovery. I mean, it's not all going to New York City, but however much New York City can attain from that, they're going to. So this SIR is apparently supposedly the public process for input, but they've been having meetings that are invitation only. I mean, how do you? I'm not complaining because I got an invitation, but it's not about me or my groups. Is that I know there are a lot of other people that have. So it's worrisome when the twin pressures of getting it done fast, but getting it done democratically and transparently, and that's what I fear. That the rush to get it done quickly is probably not the smartest way to do it. But when you have people, with rapid response and trying to get back in their homes, it's not an easy tension to try to negotiate. The one last thing I'd say about the insurance, totally right. We've been, again, since we've been talking about since 2010, we knew eventually that we'd have to engage the insurance industry. And it's not, it's about 15 state insurance commissioners have all started as issuing mandates to waterfront businesses to make sure that they have adaptation plans as part of their, the SEC issued a ruling, I think sometimes in the last 2 years, mandating that some of the larger waterfront firms disclose their adaptation planning to their shareholders. So it's just a matter of time. And insurance industry, these guys are not in business to lose money. They're going to figure out how to make sure that, we'll give you a break in your premiums, but you have to show that you're going to be, you have some adaptation and resiliency measures in your operations, in your building. So I don't. All we know is that as grassroots activists, we need the engagement of government to take on the insurance industry to have that kind of conversation. Because otherwise, I will tell you one thing: the day that Sandy hit, October 30th, a friend of ours from D.C. sent us a press release. And this press release was issued by a big law firm, D.C. Beltway firm, that represents bond underwriters. And the headline of this press release was Hurricane Sandy Recovery Relief Bonds Needed. And the whole point of the press release was, and this is October 30th, right? People are still swimming, right? But they're already gearing up in D.C. to start. Again, I'm not saying this, it's not a bad thing per se, but that's how quickly the market responds. Some of us have called this the disaster industrial complex. You guys figure out the acronym, but it's apt.
The other thing I would like to mention about insurance, first of all, most people who live down there or work there didn't read their policies because they're kind of thick. And so it turned out that those people who actually needed flood insurance didn't have as much as they thought they needed. And the second issue, which didn't get addressed at all tonight, is about the fact that, I don't know if you know about the Good Samaritan provisions, but what it is that if you, as an architect, go to someone's house and you're not paid for it, it doesn't matter. It's as though you worked for them, so they can sue you. And unless there's a Good Samaritan provision. And consequently, a lot of engineers were sued after 9/11. And that's why everybody has to they're very careful to only hire people who are on contract. So most of the people now who actually are working for NYCHA and some of the agencies are people that had pre-existing contracts. It doesn't mean they actually knew anything. And they've all got like 40 and 50 projects because that's all that they can hire because everyone else could get sued from the people. There's been a huge advocacy movement to try to go into New York State and some of the other states about the Good Samaritan laws. You could look it up. It's very complicated, but it affects us all.
Thad, I wonder if you want to.
So on the insurance, first of all, I think that we're just coming to terms now with understanding how serious the reform in the NFIP is going to be for New York City. There was a law passed last year, the Bigger Waters Act, which says essentially that no flood insurance premiums will be grandfathered. The NFIP is broke, and they're going to try to, make themselves whole on the backs of these New York City neighborhoods. We're concerned about that, so we've seen some examples where people who had been living in the flood zone and paying a reasonable insurance rate of maybe $400 a year for a premium will have to pay if they're built and they could be built to a flood elevation, let's say 3 feet above the ground, and that would seem like an adequate level of protection based on the maps that they had. Well, with the new advisory base flood elevations, many times their new base flood elevation will be substantially higher, 4 or 5 feet higher, which means that they'll be 4 or 5 feet below the advisory base flood elevation, which translates to a premium that could be astronomically higher, and that could lead to a lot of consequences for homeowners, but for neighborhoods, and for this could be the unseen hand that shapes the city in the years to come. So we're trying to understand, work with the our partners in the federal government to understand what the impacts of that will be, and whether some of the regulations that govern this should be adapted to help New York City residents get through this, or whether the only flood protection measure, for instance, for residential buildings should be dry flood proofing or wet flood proofing, or whether there's other measures that could be taken. But this is going to be a process that, and so on the subject of process, there's a lot of immediacy to all of this, obviously, because people are suffering in these areas, and we want to be able to use the disaster money to the best effect to help these people out. But so much of this interfaces with the long-term measured discussion that we're going to have with communities, and that process has to be, as Eddie said, completely transparent. And decisions can't be made for these neighborhoods. We saw the failure of so much immediate planning after Katrina. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times today about somebody who had a house in the lower Ninth Ward, and they were told a few months after Katrina that this area was slated for buyback and not to bother rebuilding. And then years later, they found out that, no, it's not slated for buyback, and actually they can have some assistance in rebuilding, and in fact, some more assistance to build to higher flood protection standards. So now they're building back, but they had to navigate this whole other level of bureaucracy. So with the buybacks or the buyouts and the assistance that is coming to people, we need to realize that there should be we should use it to the best effect possible within the time frame we're having, but the longer-term resilience of the neighborhood is going to depend on all of us working together. And so then the last point about the imagination, I would say, is that's where that really comes in. I don't think that there's any silver bullets that just make us resilient to storm, and any great architect, even if they went to the GSD, can figure this out on their own. Like, we need to have imagination that comes from listening to each other's, comes from listening to Eddie talk about hazardous materials, and then listening to Walter talk about coastal protections, and then synthesizing those ideas into things that make sense from multiple perspectives. So that's the imagination that we're most interested in, is synthesis.
Thanks. We have time for just one or two more quick questions. So, sir.
Thanks. The last speaker, Eddie, mentioned Superfund Sites. So what is the story with Superfund Sites? I mean, they have been identified, haven't they, going back decades. Where is the money that was promised, and where's the political will? What is happening with all that side of that particular issue that you mentioned?
Yeah, I was wondering if we'd back into like a sequestration tangent tonight. Listen. It's the dysfunction of Congress. I mean, there's no. That's a whole other panel that I dare GSD to take on one night. But I will say that part of the Sandy recovery money. You're right. I mean, it's unclear how the broke Superfund account, right, and Sandy will, they're all trying to figure that out, I think, is what I'm trying to say. I think part of what I keep hearing, which is both worrisome but also exhilarating as an activist, is the level of confusion going on right now in government. So what's really kind of like, for us, we're like, okay, so if we're hearing from agencies themselves, federal agencies, they're not getting return calls from FEMA, and we're like, okay, so they're not getting their act together as quickly as they usually do. Maybe we got a chance to, but what's also scary about that is, the government's not, there's levels of uncertainty, vast levels of uncertainty, that I keep hearing from some of our friends in the city of New York about decisions that have to be made with the federal, with the task force. And I think that, so I mean, what you just touched on is an example of a lot of complexities that nobody has a real answer to, right? I don't know if, Thad, you want to...
No, this is not my area. Sorry.
So I want to thank our panelists for doing an amazing job. Before we finish, I want to ask if you have a question for each other that you want to comment on each other's work. It's been a long discussion. You shared your work and ideas and important concepts, so thank you all for staying over time, and thank you so much for coming here.